Well, hello, and welcome back to the Prison Pod. We are on episode 7 of season 4, and today's guest joining us is David Garlock. And David is a formerly incarcerated criminal justice reform advocate and reentry expert, from what I hear. And David has quite a story, and I would like him to share a little bit about that with us. And then we'll ask him some questions and we'll have a conversation. So, welcome to the Prison Pod.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for the invite, and it's a blessing to be here. I always enjoy opportunities to be on podcasts and so many different podcasts. And the thing is, it's like none of them are ever the same. I mean, they go in different ways, different questions are asked, and so it's definitely a blessing to be here. Yeah, I'm a criminal justice reform advocate who was formerly incarcerated. I spent 13 and a half years in prison in Alabama of a 25-year sentence. My brother and we have a story that is very similar to the Menendez brothers, where we were sexually and physically abused as kids, and we made an irrational decision to take the person's life. It took them 4 months to arrest us after the murder. So during that time, my motto was sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and that was what got me through that time because I had to cope. I didn't want to deal with the fact that I had taken somebody's life. But when I was arrested, it allowed me the opportunity to tell somebody what had happened to my brother and me. It allowed me to tell somebody about the murder. And those were things that really changed the whole trajectory of my life. And I used my time in prison to better myself and improve myself. I was able to get a GED, drafting trade, Master's of Theology, so much things to better myself and improve myself. And then Equal Justice Initiative and Brian Stevenson helped both my brother and me get out on parole. And then everything else has led me to be where I am today.
Wow, that's amazing. Brian Stevenson, of course, everyone is familiar with him from the film. Is it Just Mercy?
Yeah, it's the film Just Mercy, but it was also a New York Times bestseller that came out in 2014. And if you've seen the movie and haven't read the book, you need to go get the book because the book tells a lot of stories of Brian's clients that were children given life without parole sentences, and you see so much of the trauma that these kids experienced before they went to prison. And I think so that book, my own experience and other research, opened the door for me to do one of the presentations that I do, which is called the Trauma to Prison Pipeline, where I talk about the amount of trauma that people endure as children that propel them on a way to become incarcerated.
Do you also look at sentencing for juveniles being sentenced as adults and also that idea of the under 25, 27 age and younger?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I bring up and talk about, especially here in Pennsylvania. So I used to work for an organization called Straight Ahead. And what we were doing, what this organization is working on, is creating parole eligibility for people serving life without parole. So Pennsylvania has the third largest group of people serving life without parole, about 5,500 people, which is 10% of the nation's life without parole population, which is 55,000 people. In Pennsylvania, 73% of those people who are serving life without parole committed their offense before they turned 25, and 50% before they turned 21. So if we had laws like DC and other states are doing as for second look laws, or the ways that people under 25 are charged and sentenced. I know California has done some legislative work around this. A lot of these men could be, and women could be released from their sentences. And that's what we have to do. You know, we have to, when there's research out there, we have to look at it. And if it's prevailing and if it's something that is showing the likelihood of their brains not being fully developed and that being a reason or part of the reason that they committed an offense, we need to look at that. I mean, if your brain isn't fully developed before you're 26 and you commit an offense, that should be one of the mitigating circumstances that they look at. I hate the fact that so many states want to take a child and put them in adult court. They are a child. Let's leave them in the juvenile justice system and allow them to get the help that they need. We don't have to say, okay, you were 15 years old when you committed this offense. Now you're incorrigible. You can never change. Is there really a child that can never change?
Well, this is one of the things that I guess it was called the Campaign to Abolish Death by Incarceration that you were involved in. And when you look at people that have been in prison 10, 20, 30, 40 years sometimes, we all change over that time period. And those people that work daily, year after year after year, to make these changes within their lives, to try to give restitution back somehow, to be restorative, um, I think that their sentences should be relooked at that point,
Yeah,
if they are
absolutely.
deserving of it.
And here's another thing too. If you went into SEI Phoenix here in Pennsylvania, which probably houses the largest number of lifers or people serving death by incarceration, which is the term that the incarcerated men came up with for this sentence. They don't call it life without parole, they call it death by incarceration because it's the other death penalty. But if you went in there and you came up to any corrections officer and you told them, hey, right now, you can choose 10 people to release from prison right now. 9 out of 10 of them, or 10 out of 10, are going to be lifers. Due to the fact of the rehabilitation that these individuals have done on themselves, due to the fact that these individuals are the people who are keeping prisons safer. These lifers are the people that are coming in straight in from the streets to go to get wisdom, to get understanding, to ask, how do I do this time? And they're the ones that are encouraging these young individuals to take advantage of the time. I always tell people, you have a choice. You can either do the time or you can let the time do you. Somebody who's doing the time is the person that is taking advantage of educational opportunities, taking advantage of drug programs, taking advantage of any type of classes they have to better themselves, to improve themselves, to look at why they committed offenses, to take classes like criminal thinking, to understand why their thinking was just so negative and led them to committing offenses. And one thing about it too is a lot of these classes like that in Pennsylvania have been developed and created by people who are lifers.
That's one thing the lifers want to, they know they're going to be there for life, and they want to have a life there themselves. I mean, a lot of them keep to themselves. They don't want to be around the young ones sometimes because they're always looking to, do a scam or getting in trouble. And the lifers want to live in harmony there amongst themselves. So, and they do have knowledge of how to survive, which is so important to these young ones coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a colleague, his name's Irvin Moore here in Pennsylvania. He served 52 years. And just he's actually a student at Penn State University right now, and he's been involved with a lot of the work that they've done at Penn State around restorative justice and criminal justice reform throughout the university. And just listening to him speak and to share his story and about what he was able to do while he's incarcerated is very powerful. And it's amazing that he's now a student and is in classes sharing that wisdom. One thing that I loved about my time in college at Eastern University is being in criminal justice classes. And my professors knew my past, so I had free reign to contradict what the book was saying if the book was saying something that was wrong. And so it opened up wonderful conversations. And one thing that my fellow classmates loved about it and loved about me having in that class is giving them that different perspective, giving them a different lens to look at. And that's one thing that's so important for speaking in universities and for organizations and people. If you're talking about criminal justice reform, you need somebody who's got that lived experience at the table, on your board, working for you. Otherwise, you're just using data and things to propel your work. You need to have the people who have that lived experience to give you the holistic view of the system.
I think you need people across demographics too, as far as age and race and religion, and because there's so many different aspects within the person that affect people that others don't even look at, or don't care.
Yeah, think about that. I just thought about in Alabama they have this thing called the faith dorm, and what's incredible and amazing about the faith dorm is the one I was in at Easterling Correctional Facility. We had 136 men in this dorm. So to get in this dorm, you had to have a 6-month clear record, which means you couldn't have any citations or disciplinaries or write-ups. You had to be attending chapel service once a week of whatever faith you believed in. And then you also had to do 3 classes a year. Now, just think about this. In this dorm, you had Muslims. In this dorm, you had Christians. In this dorm, you had Catholics. You had Jehovah's Witness. You had Native Americans. You had Jews. And you also had Wiccans. So just think, this is like a hodgepodge of all religions put into a dorm. And one of the main things about the dorm too is we weren't trying to proselytize anybody. We weren't trying to convert anybody. We all were there to better ourselves, to increase our faith, to grow in our faith. And it was so amazing to be with other individuals who didn't believe like I did, but we all got along. We were able to sit down and break bread together and eat meals together and play sports together, and there was no bickering or other things like that. And it was just so powerful that we all got along like that.
The beautiful thing about that is it was all faith-based, even though everyone may have different beliefs. So it was still that power of faith there, which I would think would also increase hope within the atmosphere. Uh, it made me think of the field ministers. Are there any field ministers in Alabama that
Field
are
ministers,
people?
are you talking about like chaplains and
So in North Carolina, they actually, at Nash Correctional, they have a college that comes in. I believe it's the Southeastern Baptist College, and they train field ministers, which are people that have life sentences, and then they get a bachelor's degree after 4 years, and they go back into different facilities and they minister within the facility that they're incarcerated. So it's a really great program, but I was just curious if they had anything like that in place in Alabama.
so there's really not anything per se like that in Alabama. There are chapel workers, so the chaplain will pick different incarcerated folks to work for him, and a lot of times some of them will actually preach when there's incarcerated services. So in Alabama, typically we had services 6 nights a week, and then also like 2 services Sunday mornings. And so 2 of those services a week would be where incarcerated pastors could preach. So it would give them the opportunity to create their messages and to preach. Um, One thing that was always incredible is when we went to these church services, the folks that came in, one thing that I always loved are the individuals that were real, that had stories, had experiences, especially those that were formerly incarcerated. Because when you're able to see somebody that is coming back into a prison that was formerly incarcerated, that had this amazing faith experience, and they're here sharing about it, that gives you hope. That gives you the ability to dream again if you lost that ability. Because you're like, wow, I want to be like Bill. You know, he was in prison, but look at him now. Look at the ways that God or whoever you believe in open those doors, and he can do the same thing for me. And that's why I always love going back into prisons and being able to share. Or with Eastern University, I was able to go in and co-teach some prison education classes, and that was so important for these men to see me, somebody who went to prison for murder, who is out, who is thriving. Because it's one thing if you see somebody who went to prison for a nonviolent offense coming back, but it's another thing for these individuals to see that I went to prison for a violent offense, but here I am, I'm out, I'm thriving, I'm succeeding, and it gives them hope. It gives them the ability to think that, wow, I want to be like David when I get out. I want to do what he's doing. I want to have that impact.
I want to take a second to recognize you for that because so many of the people that I've worked with, I've tried to get to go back to do some public speaking. And once they're out of prison, they want nothing to do with it. It's like, no, I am done. I've done my time. I don't ever want to see another prison again in my life. So it takes a certain something to be able to go back and to relive some of those experiences. I mean, I've spent lots of time in different correctional facilities across the state here in Maine. So I know the sights, the sounds, the smells, that you don't know without some kind of experience within a prison.
Yeah, I think, well, I definitely appreciate that. I know a lot of people who aren't able to do it too. I think with me, the time that really was a moment where it could have triggered me a little bit more than I thought was when I went back into the two Alabama prisons that I was able to speak in their chapel services, because this was where I served my time. Going into some of the federal prisons I went into, like at Lompoc and in Wisconsin and upstate New York, those were just like, okay, I'm going in, I'm using my story to empower these men. Going into SEI Chester here in Pennsylvania, where we do our prison education program, it was the same thing where it's like I am taking this precious jewel, this precious present to these men, and that present's education. And this education is going to be something that is going to change the trajectory of their life. It's going to give them tools in their toolboxes that they might not have had before. It's going to open up opportunities when they get out to be able to write that I have a degree. I don't just have a GED or I don't have an education. Now they can put that, yes, I have an education. I have accomplished higher education. And that changes a lot, especially when they're putting that on an application. So I think that was really the kind of most surreal experience walking back into prison in Alabama. The thing that really surprised me was the fact that they had changed uniforms. I was expecting to walk in and see these white Alabama Department of Corrections uniform that you see in the movie Just Mercy, but they now have these like brown, nasty looking uniforms. And I'm like, what happened to the white? Maybe they got tired of using all that bleach, keeping the white uniforms clean.
That's a real good point. It's probably exactly what it was. Okay, so now I'm going to switch over to another. Well, wait a minute. I'm going to ask you my trick question first. Books. Has there been a book that you have read that is one of those books?
I mean, Just Mercy is definitely that way. Written by Brian Stevenson. I I would have to say that two of his other clients have written amazing books. Ian Manuel wrote "My Time Will Come," and Anthony Ray Hinn wrote "My When the Sun Does Shine." And both of those books are very powerful. Um, they talk about experiences in solitary confinement and how horrible that time was, but how their faith helped them through, how writing, how books and escaping the reality of where they were. And that's something that I can definitely resonate with because I loved writing poetry in prison. I actually made greeting cards. My art ability was not the best, but I could write a mean poem, and my handwriting is a lot like a computer. It's very neat and small, and so people would actually think that I was having somebody print up these poems so I can just put them in. I'm like, that's my handwriting, and they're like, what? I actually got to a point where the doctors and nurses and correction officers were buying cards from me. And so we had to create a contract and they had to put money on my account. But it was really cool to think that these nurses and doctors and COs thought my work was good enough for them to buy these cards. Um,
See, I think opportunities like that should be available, because there are so many creative people that are inside that could be, you know, having a job, using their creativity, you know.
Yeah, it's definitely a powerful. And one other author that I definitely recommend too is Shaka Senghor. His first book was Righting My Wrongs. He was incarcerated in Michigan for about 20 years, and he kind of spoke about the same thing as far as in segregation and just searching and the the ways that books and writing were beneficial to keep him sane, and now he's using that as a platform to share his story to educate and empower other people.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your books with me because I always, I hadn't heard of a couple of those, so I'm going to add those to my list because, especially on solitary confinement, because I haven't read a lot. I know a lot from people talking firsthand with them and their experiences, but as far as actually reading people's books, I haven't. Okay, well, now I want to switch over to another topic. You've done some really important work out in the community, educating people on, um, I guess it is still called the sex offender registry, and how damaging that can be, and how much money is wasted in that area. And you're involved with a group called the National Association for Rational Sex Offense Laws. I would like you to discuss a little bit about that. I know that was a lot I gave you all in one thing, but I'm really interested in what your work has been doing in that area.
Yeah, well, I mean, to talk about it, let's first talk about how I got involved with advocating for people who've committed sexual offenses. So, I mean, the first thing I want to say is I think that we need to do away with labels. We can't use terms like convict, inmate, felon, sex offender. We need to use person first language. And so when I talk about this population, I use terms like person convicted of a sexual offense or person forced to register or a registrant. What that does is it takes them away from the act that they committed and talks about their humanity and that they are a person and that their humanity is valued. So I actually got into this work by chance, by coincidence. I always say that it was God that opened this door because I was getting ready to graduate in 2017 from Eastern University with my Bachelor's of Arts in Urban Studies, focusing on criminal justice and social welfare. Yes, it's a mouthful. And it was February, and I was getting ready to have a meeting with the career counselor that on a Friday afternoon. I get an email from my wife where she's talking about she found on Idealist this job for a Christian reentry home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. So we look at it, and I go in, talk to the career counselor. We find out that the executive director is a graduate of Eastern University. He got his master's degree from there. Later on, I found out that his brother, I'm going to school with his brother and we're friends. And then other things fell into place too. And just all these different things were like, wow, okay, God, I see you. But what really was surprising was the first conversation that I had with Jordan Kaufman, who's executive director. He called me. I was actually on my way to Philadelphia to see my parole officer, and he calls. I'm like, wow, perfect timing. And so he's like, hey, tell me about yourself. So I shared my story about how I've been sexually and physically abused, took the person's life, went to prison. He's like, I have a question for you. I was like, okay. He's like, the population we work with is pretty much 99% people who've committed a sexual offense. Would you be able to work with this population? I was like, yeah. And I told him, I believe in grace. I believe in mercy. I believe in forgiveness. Brian Stevenson always says, your past does not, your past does not define you. You're more than the worst thing you've ever done. Yeah, that is what he said. You're more than the worst thing you've ever done. And if I don't want people to look at me as a murderer, I can't look at anybody else as whatever offense that they committed. And so that's how I went into this work. And I looked at my job at New Person Ministries as restorative justice, because most of these men wouldn't be able to have contact with the person that they'd harmed. So I was able to be that victim by proxy with them and work through and have conversations about what they did. I'd say the hardest part of this work was the orientation, because during the orientation, they had to tell me what they went to prison for. At times, my heart would quench because of hearing of the offenses that they had committed, the harm that they did to an adult or a child was hard. But then I had to remind myself that they are a human being. They are worthy of a second chance. They are not the act that they committed. They're not what society tries to deem this population. They're not monsters. And so that's how I looked at this work. And I was at New Person Ministries from 2017 to 2020. And then it was around that time that I got involved with NARSOL. Now, disclaimer for everybody out there, NARSOL does not believe or accept sexual abuse. There are so many people out there who want to put this lie out there that people who are against the registry just want sexual abuse and assault to happen. That is not the case. And what we work on isn't about allowing offenses like that to be legal. That's nothing close to the work that we're doing. If that was the case, I would not be involved with an organization like that. And that's one thing a lot of people ask me. They're like, when there's pushback, a lot of times there's a lot of individuals in this movement who are actually on the registry or family members. With me, they can't say, but you're on the registry or your brother or sister. No, it's like, no. They're like, why are you doing this? And it's like, I believe in second chances. I believe that a registry doesn't protect our children. What protects our children is when we take that money that's being wasted on this list that isn't keeping anybody safe, and we use that money for education, we use that money towards prevention, that is where our kids are going to be safe. It's kind of like individuals like Representative Mace out here grandstanding about what had happened to her and creating these laws, and she would probably want the registry to be added upon. But my question would be to her is, did the registry keep you safe? Was the person that harms you on the registry? And her answer is going to be no, because 95% of sexual offenses that are happening right now are by people who are not on the registry. And those are things that we need to be talking about.
Well, something else too is the alienation of people in our communities. Um, we all make mistakes in our lives. That's the truth of it. Every single one of us is not one of us that's a saint that's walking out here. At least I've not met any yet. And I'm certainly not one. Um, but the idea that we send someone to prison, they do their time, they're sent home, but this population, anyone who has a sex offense, there's so many restrictions where they work, where they live. In Maine, there's certain areas where they have so many restrictions that someone could not live in that city because there's a daycare or a school and the idea about education. Nobody wants to talk about sensitive subjects, and they complain about some of the conversations we have with our children in schools. We're seeing this now over the transgender issue. People are here. We are all different. We've all had different things happen to our lives. And another thing with a lot of people who have been abused, they have already suffered trauma themselves. Somebody has perpetuated this on them. So then they, rather than us help heal them, and doing what you're doing as far as being to be a proxy member, to be able to talk about how this does affect someone, where restorative justice often is not used, that you don't bring the victim into the picture because it is too much on them and too re-traumatizing to them. So, I don't know where I'm going with this, but what I'm saying is what you're doing is you're adding another level of healing that I don't think is possible any other way.
I would also say, as far as what you're talking about, it's so powerful because when you think about restorative justice, Howard Zehr is one of the U.S.'s heroes when it comes to restorative justice. And he's always explaining restorative justice as shalom, or the state of peace or wholeness. And our legal system is punitive. All it wants to do is punish. In its goals and objectives to try to help victims, it actually punishes them more because they're re-traumatized by having to share their story over and over and over and over again. And then just imagine that you have to stand on the witness stand and look across the room at the person that harmed you and tell the court, tell the judge, tell the jury what happened. That is more re-traumatizing, and so now they've been traumatized. And what is in place for them to get healing? Really nothing. But when you look at restorative justice does something that our criminal legal system doesn't do. It allows that person that's been harmed to have a conversation with the person that harmed them, to ask some questions that our legal system will never ask. Why did you pick me? What happened? What happened to you? Why did you begin acting in this way? And it provides a space where there is the ability to have these deep conversations. It provides support for both the victim and the person that's caused the harm. And it allows the communities to be involved with this. And then who gets to decide what type of restitution is happen or what type of restitution happens? Everybody in that circle. So it's the person that's caused the harm, it's the person that's caused the harm, and it's the community. They decide what the best solution is to that problem. In Canada, one of my colleagues named Marley Liss, she is the first person ever in North America to take a sexual assault case through restorative justice. And she was trying to go through the legal system. They were dragging their feet, going too slow. And so she sought out this new, amazing way to solve this issue. And she travels the country and the world speaking about this and how important it is. If you want to learn more about work like this around restorative justice around sexual offense, I would also recommend looking up Dr. Alyssa Ackerman and Dr. Alexa Sardina. They're professors out in California, and they do work in the California prisons with people who are incarcerated for a sexual offense and help them heal. Because as you said, I mean, when you think about the trauma that the person who committed an offense has experienced, 35 to 75% of them have been sexually abused themselves. So I say that not to condone what they've done, but it allows us to understand that they had this distorted thought process of what love is, because the person that harmed them was a person in a position of authority. So this person was supposed to care for them. This person was supposed to love them. Now they've harmed them in this way. And now they're like, okay, this is how I show love. And so if that isn't challenged, they'll go through life doing the same thing.
So, what programs are working?
What programs are working at restorative justice? I'd say there are programs in prison that individuals have to take that are working. I'd say programs that aren't working are some of these state mandated groups where the individuals every week have to say that they're a sex offender or talk about what they've done. Okay, we don't need to force them to talk about what they've done every week. Let's talk about what they're not doing. Let's talk about where they want to go in life, because if you continue to focus on what they've done, you're creating this thought pattern that's what they're constantly going to be thinking about. So if they're constantly thinking about it, the likelihood that they could act on that is higher. So thinking about the cognitive brain and thought process, you would not want to have constant conversations about that. I'd say with NARSOL, one of the things that is definitely working is in a lot of states there's this thing called the Fearless Group, and it's an amazing group of family members, those on the registry, all coming together and mentoring and sharing and just helping one another. So it's a lot similar to like a 12-step program or something like that, where you have people with the same lived experience coming together, encouraging and building each other up.
Well, it would be one thing too if this was a rare occasion that these things happen, and they're not. So it's another one of those parts of life that needs to be discussed and talked about. And that's why I am so thankful to have you here today to discuss these topics, because they are hard topics to have conversations about. And not understanding. I mean, another thing that people really have been against are safe injection sites, and it's because they don't understand it, you know. So these are where we need to educate ourselves, especially within our own states. And are there are there other community groups that like prepares the community when someone's coming home that you're aware of, other than like what's going on in California?
Um, I mean, in a lot of states, I mean, just talking about reentry as a whole, there's a lot of states and counties that have reentry coalitions, and some of those coalitions have events to help prepare the community. One thing that is happening a lot here in Pennsylvania is we have a lot of reentry simulations. And so what this is it at times is at a college or some other community center, and it allows people in the community, it allows students, it allows police and others to have a small taste of what returning from prison is like. So the individual has this character. So just say they're Billy Joe Bob. Billy Joe Bob served 20 years in prison. He doesn't have family. He needs to get his ID. He needs to get a job. He needs to do these things. So they have 4 weeks. 15-minute interval equals a week to do all these different things. And it allows the people involved with the simulation to see the struggles, to see the lack of hope, to see the fact that every avenue or every door somebody goes to, something's slamming in their face. And so just the frustration, the anger that you see of these participants after an hour, just an hour of experiencing what it would be like to re-enter society, it helps them to challenge their thoughts about somebody coming home. It helps them to think, okay, what can we do better? How can we change things to make it a little bit easier for those coming home? How can we be more supportive? How can we open up job opportunities for those who are coming home? So I think anybody who has a chance or opportunity to be involved with the reentry simulation, do it. It's going to be a situation that's going to change your mind. It's going to change your heart. And you're going to look at people coming home from prison in a different way.
I love that suggestion, especially now with virtual reality, because I think they're actually developing some games that are exactly that, in prison and coming out of prison. And I know some of the prisons are actually using virtual reality, like of the local grocery stores and the colleges. They're going in and recording and then bringing it back so people can have that experience. And that would reduce fear and anxiety. I mean, because
I
especially for
think
anyone
it
who's been for a long time.
I think it would for a little bit, but nothing's better than actually having that experience. So, I mean, that's one thing that they've done here in Pennsylvania when they started releasing a lot of these juvenile lifers, where they had this virtual reality experience so they could look at that and see what reentry would entail, how to interact, how to have these conversations with people. But my idea is if you really want to help somebody re-enter like that, have a re-entry center where the person's out and about all day and then just coming back at night for the last month of their sentence, because that way they get to experience it. They get to have these conversations. They get to go and set up employment, set up relationships. I always tell people that it takes a village for a returning citizen to be successful. So it takes a person's family, it takes a community, it takes a place of faith, it takes employers, it takes landlords, it takes support groups, it takes all of these entities coming around this person and speaking life into them, because their whole life they've been told they're useless, they're worthless, and they're never going to amount to anything. Now they have these individuals surrounding them and saying, hey, you can go to college. Hey, you can graduate. You can do whatever you put your mind to. And that gives hope. That allows a person to be like, wow, I matter. People believe in me. I've never had that before. And it's so incredible.
And that is why I'm doing what we're doing today. Because as you know, this goes into prisons across the country, and we do want people to know that we care, and we want you to have hope and believe that things can change and believe in yourself. It's very important. I know it can be very hard when you're sitting inside and things look very bleak, but get yourself out of that mindset, pick up a book, exercise, do something to get your mind somewhere else, pray, meditate, whatever works. David, is there anything else that we haven't covered that we should before we wrap things up? Because you've really done a great job today, and the conversation has been excellent.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that we could touch on the Menendez brothers case a little bit because really what's happening there is something that has needed to happen for a long time. I've created a new presentation that I'll be doing next week in Denver called Survivor Homicide Then and Now. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at instances of people who have committed a murder to escape sex trafficking or sexual abuse before 2020 and then after 2020 and looking at the sentences. The people before 2020 have primarily gotten life without parole or life sentences. Since 2020, you have Piper Lewis, who got a 20-year sentence that was where she was put on for just 5 years probation. You have Crystal Kaiser in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where she was just given a 12-year sentence. And so there is a change and a push to look at individuals not as an offender or a victim, but looking at somebody as an offender and a victim, because a lot of times people couldn't look at the duality of that the fact that you couldn't be both. And think about the Menendez brothers. They are both. They are individuals who were sexually abused for years, especially Eric. He was sexually abused from 6 to 18. And with everything that's happening with the documentaries and just the things that are happening in court right now, it's important to have these conversations. And the fact that one of the prosecutors said that she didn't believe that Eric and Lyle were sexually abused because males don't have the proper parts to be raped. And I'm like, how can you say that?
That is, see, and that's a problem when we have people in our court systems that feel that way. And this is where I say that anyone who works in that field with the police, caseworkers, whatever, they need to go inside a prison. You cannot talk about prisons if you've never been in one. That's my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. An amazing organization called Families Against Mandatory Minimums, is always encouraging lawmakers and judges and prosecutors to go into prison, because there's such a change in you when you actually walk into prison and you sit down and talk to some of these incarcerated people and you hear their story. You hear the years and years and years that they've spent in prison and the way that the prison system isn't created to help them. You hear about the lack of healthcare and how they're not being cared for like society says they are. You hear about the food and sometimes maggots being on the food and boxes that say not fit for human consumption. And it makes you really think about, like, what are we doing to these men and women that are incarcerated? And it goes back to the punitiveness of our system.
Well, and it's doing more damage than it is, rehabilitative. That's the biggest problem. When you have people that already have problems. They may have mental illness or may suffer from addiction or from abuse, and then they go to prison and they're treated even more poorly. And so you add another whole level of trauma and issues, and then we send them back home with no place to live and no support.
which
And we
is more
say,
trauma.
ah, why is the recidivism rate so high?
I mean, I'm glad you said that because I always ask people, I'm like, okay, if a business was only making like 35% profit, would that business stay around? Or think about like a coach. If Bill Belichick, because you're up in Maine, you might like New England. If Bill Belichick only won 35% of his games, would he have stayed there in New England as long as he did? I mean, Tom Brady wouldn't be who he was today if he only won 35% of the games either. So, but that's the thing, if somebody has isn't succeeding like that, you fire them. You blow up the job. You blow up the business. You create a new one. But our prison system, which is lackluster in data for recidivism, that because 65% of people are going back to prison, but it's all good. It's this prison.
Well, unfortunately, it's a profession, you know, and it's an industry like our health industry. It's to make money.
Yeah, and one of the things I talk about, and I have this presentation that I do. It's called "What Textbooks Don't Teach You: Prison Reentry and Policy," and in it, I talk about who's actually making the money, because if you went up and you talk to Jill on the streets, Jill's answer is going to be that she thinks that private prisons are making the most money, which is not the case. Only 8% of the prison population right now, before everything with immigration starts happening, is in private prisons. The companies that are really making the money off of incarceration are the phone companies, the commissary companies, and the healthcare companies. These are the folks that are robbing incarcerated people's families.
I can certainly relate to that because we sent commissary boxes out over the holidays, and I just couldn't believe how little we got for $100. I understand the price of groceries have gone up, but commissary markup is horrible. And the other thing when you send money into somebody, if they have restitution, there's a lot of places that take 25% of that immediately. And I don't know, how many organizations are aware of that because we were a nonprofit for years. And whenever we sent money in, we always had to add to it 25% because we knew it wasn't going to be enough once they took that out.
Yeah, a perfect organization to reach out about that and telephones and everything is an organization called Worth Rises, and it's being run. Their executive director is Bianca Tylik. They're doing incredible work trying to make phone calls free across the country in prisons and doing a lot of work around commissary and stuff like that. I actually have a presentation called Creative Prison Food, and in it I make some of the food that we would make in prison in Alabama. So the commissary items, and while I'm making this food for the college students and faculty and whoever else is in attendance, I talk about food insecurity. I talk about cost of items on commissary, and then I also talk about prison wages. Like next week, I'll be in Denver, and the lowest rate that somebody makes doing labor in the Colorado Department of Corrections is 13 cents an hour. And I created a flyer for the amount of hours that somebody would have to work for the food that we're going to make. And it's like 170 hours somebody would have to work to make the food that we're making. And I do that where we can have this conversation about should we be paying these individuals more than 13 cents an hour? Should this food cost this amount? And who's making the money?
Well, the other thing is the nutritional value. Anyone who's in prison knows that you live on ramen noodles, and the sodium content in those are through the roof. And then of course you can add that to our health care, and that's another conversation
Yeah, we could be
altogether.
here
But
for another hour or two talking about
yeah,
that.
probably going to have to revisit another time anyway, so that we can jump onto some of the other subjects that we may have missed. But I guess we really should start thinking about wrapping things up. We've talked longer than I thought we would, but it's really been a pleasure talking with you. I would love it if you could share some links that of the books and things, that groups that we talked about, and I will add those in on the YouTube videos so people will have those for the information.
Yeah, I can
And
definitely do that, and I definitely appreciate the opportunity here. And something for the folks that are incarcerated right now, I just want to leave you with this thought: your past does not define you, but it's something that educates you. What defines you is what you do today and tomorrow.
remember, we're all blessings here, so don't forget about that. I want to remind our listeners we've had David Garlock with us here today on the Prison Pod, and I'll be back again in a couple of weeks.